Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 519. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Jennifer King. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the pod.
I appreciate that. All right. So Dr. King is an assistant professor and the assistant director of the Center on Trauma and Adversity at Case Western Reserve University. She has over a decade of clinical practice experience working directly with traumatized individuals, families, and communities with the goal of addressing the impact of trauma across systems in order to help the traumatized move from surviving to thriving. Her early work with children who experience chronic, ongoing, complex traumatic stress led to a strong interest in the questions clinicians ask and how they ask them in order to appropriately plan and carry out services. All right. Just obviously a bit about you, but Jennifer, before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from now.
So that's the same answer to both of those questions. I am in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I grew up. And I will add that it is 60 degrees and sunny on a March day in Cleveland, which is so rare. People
Nice.
are out here in tank tops and shorts. So
Wow.
We are feeling good in northeastern Ohio today.
All right. Sounds pretty good. I'm not there yet. We have some snow going on here in Bend.
I'm sure we'll have snow, by the weekend. That's how it tends to work, right?
Awesome. All right. So look, you've got a really interesting background going on. What you're doing is very interesting, and I'm really excited to share with our listeners what's going on. But let's kind of start out with how the heck you got into this field.
That's a great question. I think for many of us who feel sort of called to do this work, and I do feel called to do this work, we are the people that other people come to when they need support, when they need a listening ear. And that's always been me. So people in my life help people not in my life, people on airplanes, people at the grocery store, total strangers, just kind of open up. And I love that. I'm fascinated by other people's stories and learning about people's lives. And so I was interested in psychology initially, and I did my undergraduate degree in psychology and journalism. So at that point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to just be hearing stories or telling them. Ultimately, it ended up being both, which is great. But I was able to do an internship during undergrad at an organization that was supporting these really incredible initiatives going on across the state, researching about different services for marginalized communities throughout the state. And they were all led by social workers. So I had an opportunity to connect with other social workers and decide that would be the path that I wanted to take. And so I did my MSW at Ohio State. I worked while I was in that program with youth who had been convicted of felony charges and had to, as a condition of their probation, attend this group program that I helped to run. And that was kind of my first taste of social work practice, and I was all in from there. Also, as you can imagine, my first taste of trauma, which I didn't really fully understand at that time, or the ways that appreciating people's stories and trauma kind of fit together along with healing. So after I finished my MSW, I came back to Cleveland for a few years and worked in a school-based setting in the Cleveland Municipal School District to provide care to kids and families there. That again was a place where I was really coming to terms with the fact that I had a phenomenal education and training, and I I went into that work feeling really prepared, and then finding out really quickly that I was not prepared. Um, and so I became interested in trauma, and started reading and learning, and ultimately decided to go back to school to get a DSW degree, which is a practice doctorate, a social work practice doctorate. I did that at the University of Pennsylvania. So I moved to Philly for school, and really dove into trauma theory and practice and assessment and trauma-informed organizations and all of the things at a time where there was a lot of movement around that happening in Philly.
Mm.
So it was things kind of came together in a nice way, there.
In that, if I may, in that moment when you said you didn't feel fully prepared, talk more about that. Why?
So I think that again, I appreciate the experiences that I had, and the training that I received, and the education that I received. But when I got into a practice setting where it was an elementary school in a community in Cleveland that, like many in cities, was under-resourced, and had lots of poverty, lots of violence, all of the kind of effects of community level traumas, generation after generation. It just felt like every child that I sat with, every family I engaged with, had experienced more harm than the last. And while I felt prepared to engage in these more talk-based modalities, I learned a lot of CBT and a lot of solution-focused therapies. And when I was getting my MSW, and that's not to say anything negative about those models, but the kids I was seeing couldn't sit still for longer than a minute or two. I wasn't going to be working on cognitive distortions with an 11-year-old who could barely write her name because the harm she had lived through created, such developmental difficulties around reading and language and fine motor and all of those things. So what I actually ended up doing in sessions and in practice, it looked really different. It looked like movement. It looked like doing jumping jacks. It looked like playing games. It looked like, shooting baskets with paper into the wastebasket. It looked like what I know now was helping kids to become regulated, so that they could better engage in their classes or in problem solving with me around whatever crisis may have landed them in my office.
One thing I wanted to touch on is, you said, we were talking about, my question was to you was, you said, you felt you were unprepared. And one of the things you talked about was what you found yourself doing was, or having them do jumping jacks, or you doing jumping jacks.
Oh, yes.
Was that intentional on your part, or was it like, oh my God, I don't know what to do, but this person needs to do something?
I think it was sort of a combination of the two. It was intuition, and I wasn't trained necessarily to be oriented around my intuition in working with kids, but it made sense to me that I had needed to help the child, at least their body, to kind of get to a place of some sort of calmness or stability before we were going to be able to connect, or sometimes do it at the same time. So we did a lot of walking and talking. I think intuitively it made sense to me to take that approach. Again, it was not what I was taught to do, though.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I admire that. Because when I had been working with kids at a certain point when I was in school. One of my spots was working as a therapist in a school for kids who were having certain difficulties and challenges. And even, I was going through trauma training at the time, so I was trying to fit everything within the limited knowledge I had.
Sure.
And I was so frustrated. I wasn't as intuitive as you were. I was very frustrated. But anyway, so cool. You found yourself, how you talked about, you just were drawn to people's stories and so forth. How did it sit with you hearing these stories? These,
Yeah, I think I also, so I would, the other way in which I was unprepared or underprepared, was that I had heard of indirect trauma and secondary trauma. I had heard of those concepts, but I pretty quickly started to live them. I would say definitely within the first year of that position. And part of that I think is related to hearing those stories, but more so feeling kind of helpless. So two pieces. One, in hearing those stories, I think the positive aspect for me is that one of the reasons I love getting to bear witness in that way is that it really, I think that hearing and learning about somebody's experience can help you to see their behaviors in a very different way. And so as I got to understand what the child in front of me had been through, that I had these, of course moments, right? Of course he can't sit still. Of course she can't get out of bed. Of course that's
Mhm.
how this may be playing out for you. And what we within, the way that we have to use the medical model understand as a symptom, or that, this negative sort of reaction, it it just makes sense to me that that was sort of a survival skill that's showing up differently in a different environment. So there's a positive to hearing and understanding the stories, but I definitely um, began to feel the impact of secondary trauma pretty intensely early on.
Mm.
Having some physical symptoms, getting migraines, having difficulty with sleep, and a lot of that I think ultimately came down to I had, in my own, I guess, arrogance or being naive, or I don't know what it was, but I would hear these stories and I would feel connected and I would really care a lot, right? But then I would put this pressure on myself, like I'm the one in this room with this alphabet soup after my last name. I'm the one who is either going to help this child heal or help this family become supported, or I'm going to fail everybody. When in reality, I look back at the kids and the families that I'm so grateful to have gotten the chance to get to know, and I was not the most therapeutic person in their lives, right? I maybe wasn't even in the top 5.
Right.
The people who were those sort of like natural pillars of stability and calm were custodial staff at the school, or service folks at the school, or the van drivers in group programs, or the coaches at
Mhm.
the rec center, right? And rather than really mobilizing folks around the kids and families that I was working with, I put all of the onus on me, which was also just bad practice, but I didn't know that at the time.
That's really interesting. I hear a lot of my story in that too. It just quickly reminds me of uh, one of the stories Bruce Perry tells in his book, Boy Who Was
Raised as a dog.
Raised as a Dog. And he talks about his, I don't know if he uses this word, but there was a type of arrogance that he had, and he had to learn it through. And one of the ways he talks about is there was this older woman who I think was fostering or adopting a lot of kids, and she was just this loving woman, and she just took these kids into her arms, and he was amazed at how regulated these kids were in her presence,
Right.
and he learned a lot from that. And it just reminds me a lot of what you're saying. And
That book for me, it was like all of these separate pieces came together, and what I had been doing finally made sense to me,
mhm.
because I was still convinced that I wasn't doing things the right way. I wasn't doing things the way that I was trained. I was doing what I thought might make sense. But reading Dr. Perry's work, and then we were able to I met with him when he was in town doing a training a couple of years ago. And what we talked about was exactly what we're talking about, which is I wish I had this knowledge then. I wish I had this understanding when I was getting my master's degree, not all of these years later. And so I'm really excited we were able to create a partnership with the neurosequential model and with Dr. Perry to start the first comprehensive training program for social workers in the country. We just, it's in its infancy. It's the full program is just starting to roll out now, but I'm so excited to be able to have, essentially, I mean, it's selfish again, but created what I wanted and needed as somebody who was starting out.
That's awesome. And I want to highlight that. I also want to include, I talked about kind of featuring that in our newsletter, which we'll do
Oh, great.
coming up, because I think that's amazing. But how did all this evolve such that you're in this position now?
Yeah, I say that I'm a therapist turned academic. I'm kind of an accidental academic. It was not a goal or something that I set out to do necessarily, but when I was in my doctoral program at Penn, I first of all had incredible teachers there. I was able to learn from Sandra Bloom, Dr. Bloom, who the creator of the sanctuary model and kind of like the pinnacle of practice around trauma-informed organizations. And my experience of her in a classroom was sort of life-changing in terms of how I understood what instructors or teachers or professors might embody in a space. And so what I learned from her was that you can show up as your authentic self the same way you do in your therapy spaces in a classroom, and it actually helps to create, the same sort of dynamics that are just as helpful for individuals.
So what did you see more specifically, or witness or experience with her?
I had this sense that in a classroom, in a training, at a talk, or at Target, it would be the same. I would get the same person in each of those settings. It was her authentic self and her warmth that came through, and it wasn't super buttoned up. It wasn't high and mighty. It was an intentional approach to kind of leveling the power dynamic in the room, and very similar to what you do when you're facilitating like mutual aid groups, mutual support groups. And so that was kind of in the back of my mind. And then an opportunity came up to TA in a dialectical behavior therapy course and for the master's program there. And I had been getting some training in DBT and using it in my practice. And so I took the TA position and was able to have my first experience kind of lecturing and facilitating with master's students. And I felt that same kind of, that same kind of wholeness that I experienced in individual therapy sessions in a classroom, and thought like, oh, maybe this is the way I can just full time talk about all of the things that I got wrong when I was starting out and help folks to do things differently.
That is awesome. I love that. And that's so powerful. And when, I often talk about that on this podcast, when we're in the presence of someone, it doesn't have to be a Zen master, right? When we're in the presence of someone who's embodying that, there's such a magic and electricity that happens. You're like, wow, and it's not all about that particular person showing how great they are, but just being in the moment with whatever comes up at that. And yeah, you talk about how powerful that is within the therapeutic relationship too. And it's what people respond to.
It is. And that word magic I use often, and I kind of feel silly, but that really is what I feel. It's that those spaces feel magical. They feel electric. And I'm so grateful anytime I'm able to enter into one, whether that's, a classroom, a training, any of the stuff that I'm working on now.
Wow. All right. So you started this collaboration with Bruce Perry. Amazing. That's awesome to be able to do that.
I mean, his generosity is unparalleled. And I think any time that I'm able to connect with him or learn from him, I'm just struck. He is one of those people. He is one of those truly authentic, kind, warm, funny people who, on a podium in front of thousands of people, or talking to Oprah, or joking around on a phone call, he's always who he is. And he's been so generous with us. So I will be grateful to him for the rest of my life, because not only was I able to change my approach to practice after learning from him, I now get to help other people on that path before they have to go into the field and get it wrong for years.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So are you currently teaching?
Yeah.
Okay, you're teaching.
Yep.
And this whole conversation here has been sprinkled with these golden nuggets, but what do you feel in a nutshell? I'm sure you teach a lot about this, but what do you feel that newer clinicians or students need to know about working with people who've been impacted by trauma?
Oh, the $1,000,000 question. Um, there are so many things. So I think one, being really learning, and I don't know how I don't know that I'm successful in teaching this. I wish I were, but I think helping people to understand that it's important to, if you don't have it naturally, really develop a deep reverence for the way that traumatized individuals have been able to survive, and to touch down into the immense and deep gratitude for folks who are willing to kind of share their experience with you, and the vulnerability that that requires. I think that because there's such a push to be diagnosing and considering problems and symptoms, that it's easy to kind of lose that, and to
Mm-hmm.
lose the nuance and the complexity of people's lives. And so I think you can forge a deeper connection if you're able to really appreciate how a person has gotten through what they've gotten through. I think they also need to understand that their own trauma histories are going to be in the room with them too. Helping professionals, we tend to have higher rates of trauma exposures in our own lives. And I think that's, for some folks, leads you into this world. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I also think that it can surprise you. It can come up in different ways. And so finding out how to be intentional about managing your own stuff so that you're not putting it onto other people. The power differential in therapeutic work is another piece that I think, as a white-bodied person, a white able-bodied cis heterosexual woman, there are so many pieces that my physicality in a space brings in, that it's important for us to all be developing reflective practices and practices around self-awareness that hopefully you start as a student and then continue kind of as you learn and as you grow.
Mm-hmm.
We are lifelong learners if we're in this field, and I think we don't honor that out loud enough. Like, I love that on this podcast, you're always asking about, early experiences and the mistakes that we've made. We're learning all the time, and we're doing better all the time. And so there are things a year ago in a class, I'm sure I said that I would never say now, but we don't honor that enough. So I think just knowing that if you're on this journey, it's gonna be a long one, and you're expected to continue to learn and to grow as you go.
Mm-hmm. Well, you baited me with that, and I have to ask you. I think it's a perfect lead-in. Why don't you share an early clinical error with us? Your one clinical error.
The only one,
The only one.
that single clinical error. I guess I can think of one that's totally related to me feeling like it was going to be me, or it was going to be nobody, working with a child, or kind of, I don't know. There are for sure elements of like white saviorism that are coming up for me as I'm getting ready to talk about this story. So I'm sure that's a piece of my journey too. But I was working with a child in a school setting who had experienced lots of neglect early on in his life, some inconsistent parenting by a parent who had her own extensive trauma history and her own extensive developmental delays. and had, used substances to cope with her own symptoms. And that impacted, of course, her ability to parent. And so the little boy had been placed with his grandfather, who was aging, but was one of those kind of like stable, strong forces in the little boy's life. As he grew, and he grew, I mean, he was a big kid who was big enough at 10 to really cause harm when he was in a dysregulated enough state to become aggressive, which started happening more and more. And I think his first experience with mental health care at the time that he was 11, I think, when he got to me. And I was overwhelmed by the case. I was overwhelmed with thinking about how to keep him safe, how to keep his grandfather safe, which was a concern that they both had, and keeping him in the home without necessarily having to be considering higher levels of care. I was able to refer him to get a psych eval and start on medication and that kind of stuff. But I just, looking back, ultimately, he did have a severely aggressive episode that took him out of the school setting. He was expelled. He ended up in residential care, I think, at that point for a while, just because the behaviors had escalated the way that they had. But looking at my role and what I potentially could have done to better support him and his grandfather in navigating all of this, even if it had still resulted in him needing a higher level of care, there were other folks I could have gotten involved to be helpful. And I didn't, I thought it was on me to give the diagnosis, get a medication, and then we would do this magical work together an hour a week. When in reality, he needed more than that. But that, that's one that still sits with me now as I think about it. He was one of my first cases out of graduate school. And I just, looking back, I wish that I had known some of what I know now so that I could have better supported him and his grandfather as all of that was going on.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I know a lot of people are listening to this and they're going to be thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, I want to get in touch with this woman. I want to learn from her. How do people reach out to you? Are people able to learn from you just by going to Case Western or online? What?
Yeah, so I'm the co-director of the Center on Trauma and Adversity. The Center on Trauma and Adversity, we have a website there. There's information about me there. I also I'm on Twitter. I love Twitter, at Dr. Jennifer A. King on Twitter. My case email is going to be easiest. That's jak292@case.edu, which is on our website. I am available to do like consultation and trainings and things like that. That can go through my case email too for right now. I have a website, but I don't know that there's anything on it at this point. Okay. So the case email is probably the easiest way.
Okay. In terms of go-to book recommendation, whether trauma related or not, what would you share with us?
So definitely, if you didn't pick up on that already, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog is a good one. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Perry. Trauma Stewardship is another really good one that focuses on indirect trauma. I just recently finished reading a book called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Marie Brown, which was wonderful. The Politics of Feeling Good. That was a great one. That's not trauma related, but it's still really good. And Adrienne's voice is incredible.
Okay, awesome. So we'll have all this linked up at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. I just really appreciated your whole perspective and what you were sharing. Because it's one thing to have someone on here, it's another thing to have someone on here who is able to articulate what is going on, not just with trauma in general, but your own experience. And it was just great having you on here, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to tell you, I assign whose episode? Maybe it's Dr. Perry's. I assign one of your episodes in one of my classes because the students, one of their assignments is to do their own podcast.
Oh, cool.
So you're like the example that they
Nice.
have to all listen to.
Nice. I appreciate that. All right.
Mhm.
Well, we'll be in touch. All right.
Good to
Thanks so
see
much.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.